The gospel reading is from Mark chapter 6, 30 to 34, and then 53 to 56. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now, many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. And as Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. When they crossed over, they came to a land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about the whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And whenever he went into the villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces. They laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed. The gospel of the Lord. On a long trip, a rest stop sign is a welcome sight to an interstate traveler who's had too many hours on the road and too many cups of coffee. Rest areas on the interstate system were modeled after roadside parks and similar stops that predated interstates, and I remember stopping at those when I was younger before the interstates were so prevalent. One of the most interesting rest stops before the interstate is a place called Wall Drugs in Wall, South Dakota. Ted and Dorothy Husted purchased Wall Drugs in 1931 during the Great Depression. The town had a little over 300 people, all poor, and Ted was a young pharmacist, and he told his wife Dorothy they would give it 5 years. And after 5 years, they weren't starving, but they were struggling, like most folks in the Depression. They were beginning to think they would have to move on. And so they prayed. They prayed for wisdom and for things to get better. One hot afternoon, Dorothy lay down for a nap, but the noise from the nearby highway kept her awake. Wall was right near the route to the then under construction Mount Rushmore and other points west like Yellowstone. She got an inspiration in that moment. She realized the travelers and her had something in common. They were hot, and they were thirsty and would love a drink of ice water. The store didn't have much, but it had ice and it had water. Ted went out to put up signs with catchy phrases that promised free ice water. By the time he got back, Dorothy was already swamped with customers who wanted their free ice water. And while they were there, they bought ice cream and other wares that travelers would need. Ted and Dorothy created a rest stop. And today, Wall Drug and Wall the Town are tourist stops that draw millions of visitors every year. Psychologists and sociologists tell us that we are an anxiety-ridden and sleep-deprived society. Ancient cultures certainly had their share of stressors, no doubt about that. Starvation, marauding bandits, despotic rulers. Sadly, plenty of places in our world continue to have these kinds of problems. One would think, though, that if a person had abundance and opportunity, well, that person would be one of the happiest people on earth. And yet, quite often, the most abundantly blessed folks are still overwhelmed with things like anxiety and depression. Perhaps you even find yourself there or know someone who you can think of who is in that situation, who desperately need an emotional and a spiritual rest stop. Or to use more biblical language, you or someone you love may be in desperate need of Sabbath rest. The pandemic made the need for this even more acute. Just one example of an added stressor. something called decision fatigue. Once the pandemic hit, every endeavor used to be a moment where you had to think about, where am I going? Where am I going to stop? Do I have to take my mask? How long will I have to be in the store? Is it a place people are likely to be wearing masks or people to be infected and sharing the virus with everybody? And we continued to have decisions to make all through the pandemic. Should I get the vaccine or not? What's the best place to go? Is it safe to restart public gatherings like worship? When can we sing again? How do I reach people in this online world if I'm running a business? How do I keep myself safe if I'm one of those essential workers that didn't get to stay home during the pandemic? Each of us had our list of questions, and each of us continue to have questions that we struggle with, unrelated to the pandemic, right? And those kinds of questions that come up in our lives, some from unique circumstances like COVID and some just from the daily struggles of living, can really drain us, can make us feel exhausted and tired. Sabbath rest, true Sabbath rest, is one of the ways we recover from that kind of emotional draining and burnout. A lot of times people decided they couldn't go on vacations during the pandemic. We've restarted vacations now. And certainly some vacations have an element of Sabbath rest, but often the American vacation experience is far from giving anybody a Sabbath rest, because they're often constructed around very self-centered interests. Let's go do something fun. Let's go to the beach. Let's go to the mountains. My daughter just got back from Disney, which is as far away as you can get from Sabbath rest, as I can imagine. Let's go see something beautiful. Let's have an adventure. And those things are certainly important, and there can be moments of Sabbath in that. But that's not really what Sabbath is about. See, vacations focus in. What do I want to do? What do I get out of this? Sabbath asks us to turn our attention outward, to focus on some critical relationships. Because in Sabbath rest, we are supposed to focus on our relationship with God and with one another. The Judeo-Christian Sabbath is intended to remind us that we're created to connect not with the labor and not with the producing of stuff and not with the serving, particular needs of other people, but it's to connect with God and with others in a very special and unique way. Trying to deny that, to separate that out, is to deny who we were made to be. If we neglect our relationship with God or with each other in unhealthy ways, we are not enjoying the fullness and the respite that a Sabbath rest is intended to give us. Jesus understood the importance of Sabbath rest. He tired himself and he would withdraw from the crowd, sometimes with his disciples and sometimes all by himself. He practiced Sabbath in its fullest form. Jesus saw that his disciples, in the passage we read today, he saw that his disciples were exhausted. They had just returned from their missionary journeys he'd sent them out on, and they had great success teaching and healing, but he could see they were tired. So he said, let's get away. We've got all these people coming and needing stuff, so let's take some time and get away, because people were looking for Jesus to hear his teaching and to be healed. So they got on a boat, and they headed to a deserted place, or so they thought. And as they journeyed, at least, they probably did have some Sabbath rest. If the wind was right, it would have kept the need for rowing to a minimum. I suspect some of the time was spent just in silence. Some of the time was spent in rest for those not actively engaged in sailing the boat. The disciples might have shared with Jesus and with one another some of the specific stories from their missionary tour and their preaching and their healing. Jesus probably taught as well, repeating some of the most important parables and saying he wanted them to be able to quickly recount without thinking about it. And some of the time they probably laughed together, poked fun at each other. They could have prayed and sung hymns, psalms, or spiritual songs, as the letters of Paul tell us. They had some Sabbath rest together. You know, Benita and I at our home in Ohio had a screened-in porch. One afternoon there was a heavy downpour and we both headed to the porch. We sat there, mostly in silence, watching the rain come down and listening to the sounds that the deluge produced. It was restful. It was healing. It was a wonderful reminder about God's energy that infuses our world. We had a few moments of Sabbath together. Our new home we purchased in High Point has a sunroom that opens on three sides with sliding glass doors, and I know we're both hoping it'll provide us moments of similar Sabbath rest, although those heavy downpours have been kind of missing so far since we've been there. It was a good thing the disciples and Jesus had that time together in the boat, because when they reached the shore, the ever-present crowd had beat them to the location. Jesus saw those people, and his heart was filled with compassion. And so, once again, Jesus and the disciples got to work caring for people. The Christian vocation, the call to serve, is not something we can ever lay aside. We can find time for ourselves, for our relationships, for prayer, for worship, but our schedule might change in an instant. We might find ourselves facing the crowd or the individual who's in need of compassion. Sabbath rest always understands that sometimes real human need can pop up and require our attention. Jesus had to fight on a regular basis, sadly, with the religious authorities of his day about boundaries. You know, the religious leaders were concerned about people not working on the Sabbath. They'd created a list of rules about what you should and shouldn't do to avoid anybody working. And one of those activities they said you shouldn't do was healing. And Jesus gladly violated that rule, because Sabbath is never selfish. Sabbath is open to God and open to others, and especially open to helping people when they're suffering. You know, we all know that churches in America face a massive challenge. The pandemic, it made it worse, but Christianity has also already been in kind of a decline. You know, less than 50% of the U.S. population will say now that they're church members, and that shocks us. And plenty of reasons have been proposed, and a lot of them are correct. You know, we don't think like Jesus, honestly. We don't think compassionately. We expect people to come to us, right? If we just open the building, well, they should be here. Well, you know, we should be going to them. We expect things of people instead of loving and caring for them. Sometimes we focus more on numbers than we do on relationships. We're too rigidly locked into our weekly schedules that don't fit with our culture. Sadly, often we in churches are consumed by ideology, whether it's political or other kinds, rather than going out and showing God's love. But I think there's an underlying cause for each and every one of these things. I don't think people are drawn to church or to us as disciples because we have lost touch with Sabbath rest. The Bible in more than one place says we are vessels. We're meant to hold something. We're meant to hold God's living water. We're meant to do that so that water that's poured into us can then be poured out into the world for others to drink. If we're not taking time for true Sabbath rest, for connection with God, for connection with one another as disciples, we're empty vessels. We're bone dry. We're unable to give anyone else a drink. We don't even have enough water to sustain ourselves, let alone care for a thirsty world. If we are filled with living water, others will recognize us as a people who can speak to their deepest needs, who can give them acceptance and healing and wholeness and a connection with the Savior that we say we follow. Others are going to beat us to the deserted spots and be waiting when our boat grounds ashore. That would be, because they're going to be seeking the compassion of Christ that they see in our lives. They'll be seeking living water like those thirsty travelers who stopped at Wall Drugs. And this isn't about making sure you have all the right beliefs. This isn't about the worship style. It isn't about the architecture of the church. It isn't about any of the things that so often we focus on and think it's going to fix our problems. First and foremost, people who claim to be disciples of Jesus have to be people that connect to God, who can offer something to people who have thirsty souls. For us to offer that meaningful relationship to others, we have to have that relationship ourselves with God and with one another. So how do we find Sabbath rest in our anxiety-ridden and tired world? Well, there aren't many ways around the basics. We have to worship regularly. We have to read the Bible and study and talk about it together. We have to pray often. We have to have good fellowship. We need to find our way back to be together in ways that mean something. Study together, worship together, fellowship together, work together. Taking time each day in our individual lives to turn down the noise of the world and listen carefully for God is also important. And it's tempting, it's always been tempting for churches and for even us as individuals to develop a set of rules that'll help us understand what is and isn't allowed on a Sabbath time. And the religious leaders of Jesus tried to do this and they failed. Even our own Reformed church bearers had all sorts of rules about what was right and what was wrong. And too often when people develop rules, they start focusing on rules instead of on people. Finding Sabbath activities that bring real healing and wholeness require not rules, but wisdom. Sabbath is about intentionally carving out time in our schedule for focusing on God and focusing on those special relationships. Sabbath gives us water we need not just to survive, but live. Sabbath gives us water we can share with others. Sabbath gives us the same eyes Jesus had, eyes that are filled with compassion. Sabbath gives us what we need to minister to others and show them God's love. Sabbath draws others into our lives because they see, oh, you've got something special going on. I want to be there with you. Sabbath is a blessing beyond belief. Sabbath can provide healing for us and for those around us. Amen.